today we're looking at roughly the same period of time that we did last time when we covered Byzantine art. And that's what I'm trying to show you here. Hopefully you recognize this as part of your culture period list that you need to learn for the exam, the dates you need to learn. And what I'm trying to show you is that even though I've stuck to historical dates, I'm trying to be accurate in my list. Roughly, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Empire, and the stuff from Western Europe, which is circled there in purple, which we'll get to next, early medieval, Romanesque, and Gothic, are all roughly 500 to 1500. But they're in different geographic regions. And it's really important that you recognize this. So for this exam, we talked about late antiquity. That's early, that's kind of late Roman Empire. But the rest of this stuff, we're talking about the same period of time, 500 to 1500. But first we looked at the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine world. Now we're going to look at adjacent and slightly overlapping the Islamic world. And then our final topic will be to turn back to Western Europe and look at that same time period in Western Europe. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this, that these are contemporary cultures in different parts of the world. All right, so Islamic art, like I said, roughly we're talking about very roughly 500 to 1500. But the one date I really want you to remember for Islamic art is the date of the birth of Muhammad, 570. And that's a really useful date to know because before Muhammad, there was no Islam, right? So that tells you the beginning of the Islamic religion and the beginning of Islamic art. The reason we're not focusing on more particular dates than that is because so many of the major Islamic monuments, the mosques, have been built and rebuilt and changed over centuries, that the periods and dates are kind of long and not as exact as some of the other things we've looked at. So I think this is going to be the most useful date for you to remember and kind of carry forward after this class as well. All right, here's a map to show you the Islamic world. Now, just a couple things. First, just for familiarity, locate Italy and Rome, because we spent so much time talking about the Roman world. And now I want you to move east and look at Anatolia and Istanbul. Istanbul, of course, is Constantinople, so that was the seat of the Byzantine Empire. And now look at where the Islamic world was situated. The most important sites are circled in red, the most important sites for us as we're talking about monuments today. So you see Jerusalem, Isfahan in Iran, and then down in Arabia, Mecca and Medina. So what the different colors green tell you are our time periods. So the darkest green, where Mecca and Medina are, that is the expansion of Islam under the Prophet Muhammad. So the kind of original expansion of Islam when it was a new religion. Then the medium green color is over the next 100 years or so. And then finally the light green is in the 200 years following that as Islam spread across North Africa into Europe and over into Central and Southern Asia. All right, so very big geographic area. And then, of course, if you look at the inset, you'll see it expanded even further in the centuries that follow. Now for some history. The date I told you I want you to remember, 570, the birth of Muhammad in Mecca. And then 622 was Mecca's flight, or sorry, Muhammad's flight to Medina. Um, I'll give you just a brief background here. Muhammad was the great prophet of Islam, and he was born in Mecca in Arabia. And when he grew up, he proclaimed a message of a new religious and social order that was based on allegiance to one God, Allah. So this was a new monotheistic religion. This message was initially really unpopular among the leaders of Mecca, because those leaders, their power was based on their association with this, what we would call pagan or polytheistic sanctuary and place of pilgrimage in Mecca, which was called the Kaaba. I'll show you that in a minute. Well, here, I'll show you now, and then we can go back to the outline. Okay, so this is a time-lapse image of the Kaaba. Today, the Kaaba is a really significant Islamic shrine, and what you're seeing is a time-lapse picture of people who are on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and they're walking in a circle around the Kaaba, and that's why there's a blur right around it. Okay, so back to the history. So Muhammad's new message was unpopular, so he was forced to flee, and that's his flight to Medina, known as the Hijara. Sorry, there's a little misspelling on the slide. It should be Hijara. So that was in 622. He was able to kind of get followers together and get a little army together, and in 630 returned to Mecca and converted everyone to this new religion. And one of his first acts upon return to Mecca was to cleanse the Kaaba, that shrine we just looked at, of its pagan idols and rededicate the shrine to Allah. And that's why it's such a sacred place today, because it has this immediate association with Muhammad. Okay, he died a couple years later, and the caliphs were the rulers that followed, and they began to conquer rather broadly, as you saw on the map. So first Syria, Palestine, Iraq, then Iran, North Africa, and into Europe. So this was a very rapid expansion of this new religion and the new kind of political force behind it. And remember, I told you when we looked at the Byzantine world that one of the reasons that Islam was so successful is because people were, well, a lot of people anyway, were unhappy with the unyielding demands of the Byzantine Empire in terms of their forced adherence to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and Islam offered a little bit more religious tolerance than that. Okay, so the empire extended quite broadly. The capital was Damascus in Syria. The official language was Arabic, and Islam was the principal religion, but not the only lawful religion. When the caliphs expanded into Jerusalem, Jerusalem, of course, was sacred to Christians and Jews, and now it was sacred to Muslims as well. And the Muslim leaders wanted to build a new monument in Jerusalem that would really announce the presence of this new religion in the city. And so they built the Dome of the Rock, this gorgeous building that stands on a high plateau and sort of towers over the city. When we talk about Islamic art, we're talking both about religious art and architecture, that is, art and architecture that is intended to serve Islam, the religion, but we're also looking at secular art that was produced under the influence of Islam. So it's a bit of a misnomer to call it Islamic art because we are going to talk about things that aren't religious at all. They're just things made and used by people who are living in this world. But just to make that distinction clear. So we're going to start by talking about religious art and architecture, and then I will show you some secular examples later. Okay, now royal patronage played an important part in the making of Islamic art, just like it did in other cultures, right? The Roman emperor was the one who was having buildings built. The Byzantine emperor was the one having churches built, and so on. So similarly, construction of mosques, including their decorations and furnishings, was the responsibility of the ruler. And these monuments served the spiritual needs of the community, but also the educational and charitable needs as well. So they were important centers of society. Now, when we talk about mosques, there are a lot of parallels to churches. For example, I told you that Christian churches were often built in the basilica design because they needed to accommodate a community worshiping together. That is true in Islam as well, but there are some differences. So in Islam, the prayer ritual consists of a series of bows and prostrations in conjunction with praise to God and recitations from the Quran and prayer. So most of the daily prayers can be done in private. The worshiper points himself or herself towards Mecca. That's the direction in which you pray, and then you can undertake your prayers individually. But the Friday midday prayer service was typically at a mosque with the community. So mosques were usually designed to hold large numbers of people for those community services. This one, though, is an exception to that, and I think you can tell just by looking at it that this is not a basilica plan mosque. This is a central plan mosque, and the mosques followed the same basic architectural designs that churches had. So it's interesting, isn't it? The churches borrowed architectural plans from Roman secular buildings, right? Basilicas. Mosques borrow architectural designs from churches, so that there's a lot of continuity across these different cultures. So this is a central plan mosque, and that's because the Dome of the Rock wasn't so much for community prayer as it was to mark this very holy place. This is the site where Abraham went for the sacrifice of Isaac. It's supposedly the place where Adam and Eve is buried. It's the site of the Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So this is a really holy site. Let me show you the site. Here's a view of Jerusalem with the sacred enclosure, and you can see how it really kind of that golden dome is visible from all over the city. And in that little cutaway view on the bottom, you can get a sense of the way this is a central plan building. You can see that ring of windows at the base of the mosque, and the columns with the arches above, so that in many ways this resembles both Roman architecture and Christian churches. There's a difference in scale and proportion and decoration. All right, here's the beautiful exterior again with that golden dome. And then, unlike the Christian churches of this time period, which tended to have very plain exteriors, the mosques were beautifully decorated on the outside with tile work. And the tile work varies a lot in its pattern and color, but the base color that unifies it is blue. And I'll talk more about the different types of patterns that were used as we move on, but they're mostly geometric, vegetal, and then calligraphy. And if you look just below the roof line, you can see that there is a continuous frieze with calligraphy that is beautiful writing going around the whole building. All right, turning to the interior. In the interior, you can also see the legacy of Christian and Roman art. If you look at the arcade, that is the row of arches on columns, the use of columns, the use of vaulting, the dome. And here too, you can see in the interior the types of decoration that were used. Calligraphy at the sort of above the windows of the dome, there's a frieze again of calligraphy, and then the geometric and vegetal patterns that are used throughout the decoration. These intricate patterns create the impression of unending repetition and were believed to induce contemplation of the infinite nature of God. It's likely that this developed to such a high level in Islamic art because of the absence of figural imagery, at least within a religious context. And this goes back to the whole point about Mosaic law, the Ten Commandments, no graven images. This was taken very seriously in Islamic art, so we do not find figural representations in Islamic religious art. Okay, so this is a really beautiful mosque, but it's not typical because it's not built to accommodate all the crowds. So I want us to look at what is in many ways a more typical mosque. So this is the Great Mosque in Kairouan in Tunisia. Does it look familiar to you in terms of its design? I hope so. What does it make you think of? You might have said Trajan's Forum. You might have said Old St. Peter's in Rome. You would be correct on both counts. This is really in the model of an old Roman forum with the big enclosed courtyard enclosed by the columned walkway, and then the basilica-style building anchoring that courtyard. The large tower is the minaret. This is where the call to prayer would be issued. The whole structure is aligned towards Mecca, and that alignment you can see in the, if you look at the, I wish I could point, I'm going to try. I still don't know if you can see this, but if you look at the tower and then the two domes that are in alignment with it, that is the line pointing towards Mecca. And then the back wall of the basilica is raised slightly, and that is also to orient you in the direction of Mecca. The direction of Mecca is called the Qibla, Qibla. You'll see that word on the next slide. So Qibla is the direction of Mecca, and that wall at the far end, away from the minaret, is called the Qibla wall. So if you think about it from the perspective of one of those people you can see very tiny in the courtyard, if that courtyard was full of people, it was crowded, and you needed to know the direction of Mecca, the architecture tells you. You see the towers, you see the domes, and if you're inside the mosque, you would see the raised roof areas which point towards the Qibla direction, so that everything about this architecture helps you to pray correctly. Here's an example of a Qibla wall from inside a mosque in Cairo. The Qibla wall is lavishly decorated, which also helps you to identify the correct direction. Other words you'll see in that caption, which are important, are the mihrab and the minbar. The minbar is that platform in the foreground, and that's the platform from which prayers can be read and the Quran can be read to sort of lead the community in prayer. The mihrab is the niche in the Qibla wall. And you might recall that there was a niche in the wall of the synagogue that we looked at in Dura Europos, which was for the Torah scrolls. And Christian churches have a very large version of a niche, the apse, which is where the altar is. So this is a version of those things in the context of this Islamic building. In this context, the niche is to commemorate the place where Muhammad would have stood and planted his staff and led the prayers back in Mecca. So the mihrab is to honor Muhammad and also to give a focal point for prayer. Now you'll notice as you look at the decoration on the Qibla wall that there is again a continuous frieze with calligraphic decoration, calligraphy, and that would be a quotation from the Quran, and then also beautiful stone revetment all over the walls, very much like we saw in the church in Ravenna. All right, here's the plan of a mosque in Isfahan, Iran. Now, the mosque is the sort of main building on this plan, and you'll notice there's another building off to the right at a different angle. Remember that the mosque has to be aligned to Mecca. Other buildings don't. So sometimes mosques are at unusual angles in reference to other buildings, and that's the case here. So that if you go through that courtyard and enter this mosque, you're coming in at a funny angle. And so it was even more important to help people orient themselves spatially. I don't know if you've noticed this, but most people have at some level a kind of built-in sense of direction, almost like a built-in compass. And you can kind of sense which direction you're going as long as you can keep track of it in some way. But if you start to get turned around, it's confusing and it's hard to get that sense of direction back. So what they've done here is they've given you even stronger architectural clues to help you reorient towards Mecca. And that's in the form of the Great Iwan, which is marked here on this plan. And I'll show you what that looks like, and you'll see what an incredible visual marker it is. All right, here's what that Great Iwan looks like. It is an enormous dome with an enormous kind of a gate or facade in front of it with these two tall minarets marking the sides of that entrance. And then the entire thing covered in this gorgeous blue tile work. Okay, another example where you can see the tile work more closely. This is a mihrab, one of those niches, that's been removed from a mosque in Isfahan and is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And looking at this closely, you can see the different types of decoration that were used in this tile work, where the base color is blue, but there's also a lot of other colors added. There is vegetal designs, there are geometric designs, and then there's a lot of calligraphy that's used, including along the frieze border of this whole mihrab. Okay, I want to turn now to secular art, and I'm going to start with a really remarkable monument, the Alhambra. The Alhambra is a palace in Spain, and I'm only showing you this one small view of it, but I encourage you to look at more pictures of it because it is a beautiful palace with a lot of different courtyards and rooms and things to see. And it was, of course, a palace for the Islamic rulers of this area in Granada in Spain. And it's famous today for the beauty of its architecture and its fountains. As we look at this courtyard, I hope you'll recognize that it is a variation of a Roman peristyle courtyard, right? The kind of thing somebody might have had in the back of their house, with a columned walkway running along the exterior and a fountain in the middle. It's just a very grand version. And then there are differences in Islamic architecture. There are many more varieties of arches. And just in this one courtyard, you can see many different shapes for arches. And then all the different types of stone decoration on the walls of that arcade. There are a lot of different types of what we call decorative arts that are associated with Islamic art, because all of the different fittings for spaces would have been richly decorated, whether they were textiles or metalwork or ceramics. Islamic artisans really excelled in these areas. And in fact, I encourage you to go to the Museum of Fine Arts, and they have a beautiful collection of Islamic art. It's on display in several different galleries there, but you can ask for directions to it, and they'll point you to the right rooms. And you can see in person some excellent examples of metalwork and ceramic and textiles, and it's really, really worth seeing. I'm just going to show you like one example of each thing now, one example of ceramics and textiles and metalwork to give you just a little taste of it. So this is an example of ceramics. It's a very shallow bowl. It's a really simple design with minimal decoration. The only decoration on it is this calligraphic inscription around the rim of the bowl, but it fits the shape of the object really perfectly and makes for a very perfect and elegant object. I also like this one because of what the inscription says, which I think is very appropriate for students. It says, "Knowledge. The beginning of it is bitter to taste, but the end is sweeter than honey." So of course it means it's tough getting there. It's hard to learn things. You have to put the work in. But in the end, it's sweeter than honey when you know all the things. So keep working, keep studying. All right, textiles were and are very important to Islamic interiors. Rugs, cushions, silk hangings all serve to define a space and make it comfortable and make it beautiful. Early textiles are rare, however, because they typically don't preserve very well. So this one's really special because this dates to sometime before the year 961. It's today in the Louvre in Paris. And what's really cool about this, the reason that we know it dates to before 961 is because that was the date of the First Crusade, when the mostly French armies left France for the Holy Land to try to win back the Holy Land for Christianity. They didn't like it being in Islamic hands, so they went on the crusade to try to win it back. And while the Crusaders were in the Holy Land, they would pick up holy objects, and we'll talk more about this in future lectures, but these holy objects were called relics. And there's all different things that these could have been. Like, you've heard of some relics like the Shroud of Turin, for example, or a piece of the Holy Cross, or the bone of a saint. So these holy objects would have been brought back to France and put in churches, and then they became devotional objects for Christians in Europe. So back to this piece of fabric. This piece of fabric was used to wrap up one of those relics that a crusader found while he was in the East and brought back to France. And it was put inside a reliquary, in a container, in a church in France. And only much later did someone open that reliquary and realize that the relic itself, the bone, was wrapped in this piece of fabric, which itself was a work of art and a rare piece of fabric from early on in the Islamic tradition. So we get to see it today. And what's fun about it is, because this isn't a religious object, it does have figural decoration. It has these elephants on it, very powerfully rendered elephants. And then along the side you can see a caravanserai, a caravan of camels, as well as what we would expect, the geometric and vegetal and calligraphic decoration covering this beautiful fabric. The inscription here, by the way, is not from the Quran. It says, "Glory and happiness to the commander Abu Mansur Bukatin. May God prolong his prosperity." Okay, here is another type of fabric that was significant and still is in the Islamic world: carpets. Beautiful carpets continue to be made. They can be made of different materials: wool, silk, for example. They can be knotted or woven. This is a knotted wool carpet, and it's covered in these vegetal motifs like a garden. And in fact, it probably is meant to invoke the gardens of paradise. And this may be a fragment of a much larger carpet that was originally used in a mosque. So when you think of Islamic art, you should call to mind things like tile work and carpets and metal work. So here's one example of Islamic metal work. This is made of brass with other metals used as inlay. You'll notice that, kind of like a Greek vase, it's divided into registers. The central register, the main one, is a narrative of horsemen and soldiers. The figures are very lively, they're full of motion, and they're set against a background of twining plants and dogs and falcons. So really, really intricate work of art. And then finally, one example of a manuscript, because I like manuscripts, and we've been talking about calligraphy. We've seen calligraphy on a variety of media. It's the most important and pervasive element in Islamic art, and we've seen it on most of the pieces we've looked at. It's considered the noblest form of art because of its association with the Quran, and calligraphers enjoyed a very high status in Islamic society. So this is a manuscript page made of vellum, remember, which is calfskin, and it's ink but also gold applied to the vellum, and this is a page from the Quran. All right, we'll end there.